We've got our title for this panel is called Capital for a Regenerative Economy. And that's a word that you hear very often as word regenerative this and regenerative that. Before we dive into that subject matter, I'd like to start with asking each of our distinguished panelists here. Anne-Louise, when I read through your bio, you can almost read that your work has been sort of rooted in deep value understanding and sort of a sense of economic justice. Is that a fair assessment?
It's really difficult to say no to that. Yes, I'm an angel sent to, it's been rooted in my career for a long time, and I also noticed Richard saying I had a very, 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 very long career, which makes me very, very, very old. So no, it's always been like that. I've always worked with sustainability and impact. I've done due diligences for Danida and sort of more public sector initiatives in the merchant markets, and then I moved in from that into the more sort of venture seed, and we have SDG Invest, which is global equity, large companies that we invest in through a sustainability methodology that we developed. So yeah, it's kind of in my DNA.
I think it's something you sort of nudge to. I can definitely also nudge to my journey. The values sort of, there becomes a moment. Also for you, Alan, you started in JP Morgan, so you came from sort of risk assessment in the traditional sense, but you are now like on the cutting edge frontier of trying to price natural system. Would you share your transition and the key motivator for that work?
Sure. I've been thinking about that, and the first sentence that comes to mind, this is the advice that I got on my first assignment: just make sure the risk is priced correctly. Because if we don't do that, forget everything else. That was back in 1993. Clearly, we haven't repriced risks so well after all these different bubbles. Global financial crisis was, for me, the turning point where I realized it's not just about mispricing of risks within a derivatives business at JP Morgan. This is about collectively mispricing risk. And more than that, actually risks that are completely unaccounted for, right? Like climate risk, which is just, where we're starting with carbon, our water cycles, biodiversity, all of that is starting to come in. And, for me, one of my inspirations was my daughter, who 5 years ago, when she was 8 years old, I had a dinner where I invited one of my good friends, Steve Galster, who's dedicated his life to protecting animals, a world free of animal and wildlife trafficking. And as I put her to bed, just feeling so good that, she got to meet one of the people I look up to so much, she asked me this question, which was heartbreaking. It was, "Daddy, what would it feel like to be the last white rhino? Your family's been killed. Your friends are all dead. You're all alone. You have no one to play with. You're just walking alone." And that's what an 8-year-old child is thinking about. That is like there's something profoundly wrong in a society where this is something that children are thinking about. And at that point in time, I'd shifted from kind of looking at, risk management for companies to systemic risk management, but still doing kind of financial network analytics back then with a Finnish company, FNA, and making all kinds of charts of risk and realizing, risk is really high. Everything is just clustered together. Even if markets go up, everything is interconnected. But at that point, I realized, we have to do something about it, right? So risk management is not just risk measurement. It's actually doing something about it. And so the transition that happened, I'd been following Bitcoin for a while, and I thought it was interesting. I've been looking at kind of exponential. Part of understanding risk is understanding exponential trends, right? Risk grows exponentially, and game changers are all exponential. And it was clear to me fairly early on that Bitcoin and the whole cryptocurrency system was going to be transformational. But the penny dropped when I realized that we could use something like a forestry carbon credit, right, to create a token like a Bitcoin backed by impact, right? And that was the transition. And so I shifted completely into the blockchain world after talking to institutional investors and all the big institutions and realizing that people mean very well, great conversations within these big institutions, but they don't move quickly, right? What I love about the blockchain ecosystem is that people are just building things, right? I mean, one of the things that just happened a couple of months ago is a startup, a DAO, not even a startup, it's a decentralized organization. They took a fork of Olympus DAO, forked it, and then created a base carbon ton token that structure has now soaked up 11 million tons of carbon credits. Biggest buyer, voluntary, in the world during that time, right? And this is literally like these kinds of things are happening and are just empowering everyone to move. So yeah, that's a long introduction to how I got there.
Obviously, we could rabbit hole completely into that one about how we could save the world with blockchain and the token economy. It's really interesting. I would have loved Alejandro to be here because I've gotten to know him since I came back to Denmark. And he is working with the established system to make this happen. So maybe the two of you can compare notes.
Yeah, we need both.
For sure.
Yeah.
Before we get more into the subject, regenerative. It's a word that everybody loves to use, but I, for one, have a really hard time coming to terms with it, what it means. And so I'd like to have your take on what is regenerative capital. Anne-Louise, you go first in this one.
And you wrote that out in your intro to us, and I was about to write, what's your approach to that? I'm like, that's a really difficult question. So what is our approach to that? So I think that it's the whole concept is about taking, let's put it into normal words, taking normal money and putting into use of solutions that somehow help save the world. That's a very simple way of saying it, but simple can be good. So simple answer to difficult question.
Okay. What's your take, Ellen?
Yeah, I would like to just give my perspective on what I mean by a regenerative, maybe economy on a larger perspective. And so first of all, what it's not is extractive, right? So we're in an economy that rewards extraction. The fish, we pay for them when they're taken out of the sea, but we don't pay for the people who have marine protected areas to allow the nurseries and so on and so forth to thrive. And so the concept of regenerative to me is natural, right? First of all, it's something that we see in nature everywhere. Every apple tree, every single apple on that tree can generate a forest, right? So there's something very, very special in how nature works. And I've gotten very inspired by some just indigenous wisdom from ages when they figured out how to tend their gardens, like the Native American Indians. Right? Their philosophy was to be, I call it earth positive. Leave the world better than you found it. Think 7 generations ahead. Take a careful footstep and have take responsibility for that and have a handprint that's bigger than the footprint, right? So to me, if that's the guide, those are the guiding principles, not mine, not my invention, that was invented millennia ago. But if we start to apply that into our economic thinking, and change an economy around from being in service of profit, but being in service of a greater whole, of the planet, of the earth that we're all a part of, then we're starting to move into a regenerative direction.
Yeah. I think
what do you think it is?
What do I think? Well, I think there's truth to both. And what I think is that there's one thing for certain, is that personally, I have been challenging myself so hard, and I do it every day, of not going into the linear, of embracing the circular, of forgetting that it's black and white and going into a space where it's complex, and forgetting that I'm not in a competition, I'm here to collaborate and connect. I'm not here to apply zero-sum language to my world. I'm here to embrace it it's the masculine to the feminine, which is really hard for our world to do because we have been sort of drilled hardwired into this masculine terminology about everything. So what I know is that it's really complex and it's really messy and sometimes it hurts. But I love the simplicity of your statement. And to my question earlier on, where I asked about how hard are you as fund managers working on the literacy aspect of your investments? How hard are you trying to understand the subject matter and thereby the investments that you're ultimately investing in? I think that is the paramount topic that you have to embrace, and that leads to a regenerative mindset, which ultimately leads to the we and not the I. So there's a big morality journey as well.
But the problem is it's going too slow.
It's going way too slow.
Yeah.
But it's quite simple. It's going back and listening to your heart instead of your mind, I think. Sometimes we're overcomplicating it.
But we build this entire world on the opposite. And I think that's a really big struggle. So not long ago, I sat next to a guy. He was a really hardcore investor. And he said, I've just been to COP26. So what did you get out of it? The world is burning. I said, really? Surprise. But then he said, so I've changed my investments now. We're doing investments in the Congo. We're buying forest, and we can sell it. And so, okay, in a way that's good. But on the other hand, he's taking the old model, and he's now just seen a really good business opportunity in carbon credits. But he's going the same way as always. He's still flying his private jet. So I think, we have to consider that we have to get the real, what I call the normal money before, and we have to make it work in a different way, and that is a huge challenge.
It is.
Yeah, but we need to do it fast.
You need to do it fast. Could I ask somebody in the room, have you tried to challenge your own business models and the way that you're going to generate returns? I mean, beyond the triple bottom line. Show of hands. Nobody. There's one.
Yeah, that's one.
Mm-hmm. It's good. One is better than none. And because it is the game we're in, we are literally building the plane as we're flying it. There's no doubt about it. And nobody in this room has the answer. We're all navigating this together. And that's kind of cool, too. I want to dive into another term that you're working with, Alan. Liquid, natural capital markets. Can you define that for us in layman terms?
Sure. Wouldn't it be really interesting if we had the ability to put money into a bank that was actually backed by nature, where you knew that whatever currency was created there actually had a net positive impact as opposed to being lent out to various extractive industries. For an asset to have that characteristic of being super liquid, there needs to be massive liquidity. And that's been the problem in the natural capital space, which is very grassroots, very risky, small projects. Indonesia, our mangrove project in Myanmar, from the beginning until now, it's now a military dictatorship in Myanmar. We are sending money in through, basically carriers taking cash, because if we sent it by bank wire, it would be intercepted, right? These are super risky kinds of things. So how can we actually create a market where tons of these grassroots projects with super high impact can actually be funded at scale? I think what Klima started to do, I mentioned the base carbon token, was very, very interesting. The carbon credit market is very, very illiquid, mostly over the counter. And there's, basically there's an expiry, essentially. There's a term structure where older carbon credits are worth less, right? Which doesn't really make much sense, because actually if someone who protected a rainforest in 2012, and that's why it's still there, now they can't sell it to someone who wants to offset, because they need to get the current vintage, and certainly not longer than 5 years. What Klima did was they created a base carbon token where anyone holding Vera credits could basically register that as an NFT, non-fungible token, which would be fractionalized, which is part of a pool. And they've created a significant pool so that you can trade, tens of thousands of dollars of this without moving the price significantly, right? And that started to soak up. They've created this, black hole, they called it, for carbon, right? So in 2 months, 5% of the outstanding carbon credits, over like a decade, boom, taken in. Mark Cuban saying, every week I go and buy 50,000 tons of base carbon token, and I put that into the Klima DAO, right? That only happens when you have liquidity, right? And now, Rune Christensen here, the founder of MakerDAO, he wants to create DAI as a currency with purpose. Right now, DAI is backed by Ethereum and a few other assets. He's now saying, you know what, we're in a serious climate crisis. We're heading on the worst possible trajectory. For us to have a future, we have to start to allocate that. So he wants to back the DAI, the dollar-linked stablecoin, by natural assets that are regenerative. So people can say, if you hold DAI in your wallet, it's not going to have a negative carbon footprint, a negative footprint on nature and things like that. But he can only accept liquid assets into the collateral, right? So if we want natural capital to grow at scale, it has to be liquid.
And I'm not entirely sure it's the right solution, because I think that will prompt a lot of people, investors, and companies to buy, to get to net zero instead of actually changing behavior and changing the way they run the business. So we're debating it a lot, and I think that, for now it's a good solution, but long run we need to have some much more radical solutions to fix this issue. And I think that as soon as we allow that sort of, you can just offset things, then we do allow it. And I just don't think it brings the world at a fast enough pace towards the regenerative economy.
I would like to counter that a little bit. I agree that just saying you're carbon neutral is not enough. I call it, essentially, it's Titanic third floor risk management, I call it, right? Everything's clean on my floor, ship's still going straight into the iceberg, so it's not enough. We have to go be regenerative, right? It's just like saying I'm a good guy, and that, to me, that's kind of sustainability as well, right? It's not enough to be sustainable, we have to be massively regenerative, right? That said, what's really interesting, if you talk to 100 economists around the world, and you ask them what is the single most effective policy response in terms of cost benefit, they will agree that a price on carbon is the single most, not the only one, but the single most, and we have to get that one right? So that's the start. And the other thing that's interesting is Klima, in those 2 months, within 2 months, they themselves increased the price of carbon credits by 25%. So it's getting more and more expensive for companies to do this, right? So driving liquidity, when you have a liquid market that increases the price, and suddenly all these big corporations are realizing they're scrambling to do that, right? So it's one of the very powerful arsenals is essentially to make sure at least there's no externalities, but it can't go on with the same extractive mindset, of course. We need to transition there, but I wouldn't criticize carbon credits as just window dressing. I would recommend reading a book, Ministry for the Future, amazing book by Kim Stanley Robinson. He's sci-fi author focused on climate. And a little bit of a spoiler there, one of the solutions to radically, and not the only one, but one of many, is actually a global carbon coin. Right, and I'll let you read the book for that, but it's part of the systemic shift that's super scalable that we need. It's not enough, but we need it.
Yeah, for now.
Again, it really is a testament to how complicated it is. And I look at, I've understood what Alejandro's work and how we actually need urgently to have a pricing system in the aligning with the financial market that preserves our natural capital, not degrades it further. That's kind of the baseline, right? And then beginning to restore through that mechanism would be great. But of course not when it's just an offset and then business as usual, then nothing will happen.
Well, we're not all as idealistic as we are.
No.
And unfortunately, the world doesn't, 98% of all investment is still in traditional investment, which includes fossil and weapon and tobacco and all sorts of things that kill us and kill the planet. So, as investors, we need to backpedal and say, okay, we have to start from scratch in a way, in our way of thinking. And so, yeah, it's fine. I'm with you, but I also think it needs a lot more. Agree with the price on carbon. That I think is probably the best move we can ever make. But we need price on all the things we drag out of the planet.
Yeah, I worked a lot in food, and the obvious thing is to change good consumption with, bad consumption for good consumption, which just creates more consumption in my book after 18 years having tried to do it. But what I'm really interested in is how we can change entire systems, or how we can allow systems to collapse for another system to emerge, which are some of the things that will inevitably happen as we begin to, in food, for instance, do precision fermentation at a cost and a scale that is going to challenge the value chain of the existing systems. What I'd be interested in, because we're talking a lot about the matrix by which we measure the impact, and by how we're talking about EU taxonomy, which is kind of a good sort of starting point framework to begin to work with. But Anne-Louise, you have been developing sort of a screening framework for your investments. Could you share with us a little bit about that?
So SDG Invest was put in the world by some investors that they couldn't find an alternative where they could invest sustainably as it was 4 or 5 years ago. And so we looked at what did the market have to offer, and what we agreed was we have to develop our own from the basis of leadership. So 50% of the screening is leadership, and the leadership parameters go into all sorts of leadership parameters, but it also includes other things than climate. So it includes diversity, or innovation, or stewardship in products, and circularity, and a lot of other things. And then we have the more sort of check the box, the governance, and what we call sustainability, which is sort of human rights due diligence and your assessments, etc. And we're using it, and we were always told, well, you compromise on your ROI if you have anything to do with sustainability or sustainable investment. And we proved that we didn't have that. But in the beginning, we were seen as the bad guys, basically because we disrupted the market. Or we came up with solutions and people said, wow, she's crazy, why is she talking like that? But now they're not laughing so much anymore.
Do you think we need some kind of standards? I mean, not just the minimum best, but sort of a broader standard that everybody agrees on that can help all of us? Because I often think that now it's a competitive advantage to have the right screening criteria, and it shouldn't be like that if we got a bigger agenda to reach. What's your opinion on that?
We should all measure. We should measure the same things. I was with PwC for a while, and with an accountant sort of thinking and accountant hat on, it's of course you should measure, and you should measure it one-to-one, just like you do with financial data, but it is just really difficult. And the EU is battling, mainly because we put a lot of really technical people together, financial guys together with companies. But I think eventually they'll crack it. 100, 200 years ago when we said we have to have an accounting system, people were like, why? I have my little box here, there's money in it. And people didn't necessarily want to run equal accounting systems, and now they do. So I think it's going
to happen.
Yeah, it's going to happen.
Do you have, in the room, do you have any questions? I mean, we're talking about big systems change here, and also how we can, as investors, put our money in the best, maximize our impact, and minimize our risk of failure. Is there any comments to the panelists and all of us up here? Are you going dead? Yeah.
So I would like to ask you, what is your take about degrowth? Because I feel that's a topic in transitioning to a new model and disrupting the way are being done now, but we don't talk much about that at all.
Is that as in how we measure growth? As in?
Yeah, no, degrowth as a goal to transition also. You see?
You want to comment on that?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, right? So how we measure growth?
No. I think degrowth is actually a topic.
Degrowth.
So degrowth.
Degrowth.
Yeah, that's it.
The opposite of
De-acceleration.
Yes. So you mean it could be almost a KPI, how much you didn't grow?
No, I think in a more like systemic way. Now everyone, like the system is measure growth, you know?
Yeah.
But what we are like consumption and waste and everything, you know, it's on the other side. So yeah, degrowth is actually a topic, but I think that many actors, including like all of us maybe, are sometimes not so incentivized into tackling degrowth as much as, you know, other
I
things.
think there's a whole argument about the way we grow or the way we perceive scale and growth. I've really been brought up in the global food system, the global supply chains. And if I look at what needs to happen, it's a relocalization. Relocalization of food production, of raw material input, of the variety that we use, both for human and planetary health. There is a model there, there's a pathway that could lead both to with something that conglomerates could embrace long-term strategically, where you sort of become you repurpose the word global. Where we had it in the 90s, it was all about how you talk to consumers, but now it could be all about how you provide products to the market, which can be in a symbiotic relationship with the greater purpose of what we're trying to achieve. I think there's a path, but that path doesn't fit with the current model, so something you'll have to give. And I think especially when you talk about food and ag, I think there are giant collapses waiting to happen. And Mama Nature is going to be the biggest variable in that equation. But it's also going to be human health, it's going to be global supply chains and everything else. But I think there's an argument for it. And I think there's a real challenge to us when you look at the investment case, to look at where's the resilience in providing something completely new for the market, not just another service or another product that goes into or replaces something with a good proposition to what was perceived as a bad proposition, but completely changed the marketplace and the perception of saying. And that's the innovation I'm not really seeing in a big scale, except people like Alan and Alejandro that are really working with new ways of combining the planetary systems into our existing financial model. That's my bit on answering that question.
I could answer as well from my perspective. You know, I met one of my heroes at Stanford, Dr. Paul Ehrlich, and the first thing he said to me, fractional reserve banking system, it forces us into perpetual growth, right? So number one, right? That the degrowth message, you know, means total financial collapse of the existing system. A lot of people might like that. Most people won't, definitely not the people in power. So the message of degrowth will be a very difficult one to swallow. By the way, he's working with a Kenneth Arrow Nobel laureate economist on an economy where he assumes there'll be 4 billion people on planet Earth, because he thinks a lot of scenarios like we need to think about like massive degrowth scenarios and be resilient for that, right? So from my risk perspective, we need to really start thinking about risk and resilience. I think that's it. Risk, resilience, and well-being, right? That gets you to the planetary. Boundaries work, yeah, that's so fantastic. So I would, just in terms of the narrative, I would, as opposed to, fighting straight on the existing system, I would create a narrative around that from that perspective. But I'll mention one more thing. If we factor in natural capital, we actually see that that our economy has been erasing massive amount of value, and there has not been growth. If you look at desertification alone, the UN's latest estimates are that humanity loses $15 trillion of value every year due to desertification, largely driven by agriculture, amplified by climate change and all this other stuff. That's close to 20% of GDP. That's been going on, for a while. That's just desertification. That's not climate, water, all this other stuff. It's an illusion that we're in a growing economy because the economy doesn't include externalities, right? So the first thing is let's actually put, if you want to say we grew, okay, let's put the real stuff in there first.
I think that's a really good question, by the way. And I think that it also questions how people are inside. Because we think, okay, maybe we don't want growth, and maybe some sort of little growth is okay, but not extreme growth, and we shouldn't say that just because the value goes, crazy in a hockey stick, it's success. But I also think, we are super smart. People on this planet are super smart. I think we don't want to swim backwards. I think people really like, we can lessen it, but I think most people like to have understanding what it is they're buying. And I'm a little bit more worried when people say buy local and localize everything, because I traveled a lot in emerging markets. And if we do that, we'll leave a lot of people really, really poor and really, really hungry. So we have to think of it in a more holistic way. And I think that we have to find solutions. Basically, we are challenged. We have to come up with some really good solutions for saving the planet, and I think we will make it. But I'm not as I'm always an optimist.
Just to go on that path of radical solutions, which I don't have, and I like to throw one idea, is particularly to Alan. Obviously, we're talking about incentives, like how to incentivize, behavior change in many levels. We know, you mentioned the carbon credit prices going up, great, incentive for companies to save on their emissions. In that respect, we've got the EU regulation coming in. But I'm also, in many ways, every time we talk about behavior change, we know, coming from epidemiology, and as a nutritionist, my God, that's hard stuff, right? But now coming to the non-fungible tokens, is that our solution here? We have a Filipino company, obviously, where we have already thousands of people who are earning a living by playing a game. Now, will we have NFTs to save the world in terms of really incentivizing, giving true monetary incentives to also individuals to change their behavior? I'm looking with a lot of excitement to see the first preventive health company really providing incentives that make people move. Thank you.
Awesome comments. I love this topic of, all right, incentives, right? Like, as one economist says, show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes. We have incentives for extracting, maximizing profits. The outcome is going to be we'll have an extracted Earth, with a bunch of very financially rich, small minority of people who are at the top, and a very degraded biosphere. So impact has value. We all recognize that, right? We measure it, and now there's starting to be a price on carbon, and the fluctuations are huge. Everything from people saying, like the US government, the social cost of carbon is $32. Stanford saying, oh, well, we took your scenarios and we just looked at some of the second order effects, and that's $220. And then, they use the 3% discount rate for the future. So if you kill 100 million people in 100 years, not a big deal. It's, we get to discount that. We have all these completely flawed models, and others are like $400, $1,000, right? So there's huge variability. But once we sort of hit a critical mass and get a liquid market in that, and that starts to be one of the incentives, and then we factor in biodiversity, hydrological cycle, resilience credits, and all those other things, right? Like, for example, mangroves, which Alejandro and I have focused on. Australian researchers have recently published that the average value of a mangrove forest is $194,000 per hectare per year, right? If you incentivize communities $50 a year, as Costa Rica has done, to not deforest, that lowers deforestation massively, right? Most of the value of that is actually coastal resilience and insurance, right? but it's also climate, it's biodiversity, it's food security, all that. They're like massive nurseries, right? So if you're starting to kind of recognize that, wow, if we start to incentivize these communities in this way, you know, what Alejandro and I talked about earlier, it's too bad he's not here, but I'll share the conversation. He said, you know what, the whole registry, it's so complicated, the carbon rights and, you know, and what could blockchain do with that? And so I proposed this idea of like a global blockchain registry for carbon where the rights are distributed to all the stakeholders, including every human being on the planet and every, certainly, person in a community. So what if, for example, a certain portion of the carbon credit sales went as direct payments into digital wallets every single day to every person, so that as the natural capital is replenished, people are getting wealthier. And this is a form of inflation. If you're living in Venezuela, that's why you like Bitcoin, because it's not being inflated away. So this is backed by intrinsic value, right? So I'll just close with one little last experiment on like how the planet can be changed dramatically within 1 decade, right? So someone publishes, the Bitcoin white paper, because of the financial crisis, realizing that the system is fragile. Within less than a decade, teams of engineers have self-organized to scour every single source of cheap energy, a lot of it coal and so on, but it's motivated them in a decentralized way. Every place you could get cheap energy, they've done that. Now, imagine if we had a system where people were incentivized through regenerative actions to earn these coins anywhere. You can pick a project in the map. Restore.eco from Crowther Lab is going to estimate the ecosystem services of that, and if you demonstrate that you're regenerating it, you're getting the regen coin, right? So I think it's a super good question. I'd love to discuss it more with you.
We'd love to have more questions. We run out of time. Thank you so much to both of you for being sports.
Thank you very
And I
much.
hope that we provided some kind of a different alternative world to the one that we all operate in every single day. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.